great last year. How many of y'all were able to go last year? And you remember it? I really loved it. It was great. So come, have fun, eat good, bring a friend. This announcement, we have been growing, which is a wonderful thing. Our church is growing, and we're adding new families, and we're having visitors, and we're having young families with kids. So we have some growing pains along with that. We just need help. As we're growing, we need more help. And so Rhoda has asked me to make the announcement this evening. If you want to, we would love to have you help work in the nursery or extended session on Sunday mornings. The more folks that we have who are available to help, it kind of extends the rotation, so you won't have to be called on every single week. So if you're interested in that, talk to Rhoda, and she would love to find a way to get you plugged in there. Also, reminder, the Hungary mission trip is coming up really quickly. So we're still praying and making final preparations to send our team out. But we still have these little sheets, little half sheets out in the foyer on the table of ways you can support and ways that we as a church can participate, not just kind of send them off, hope it goes well, and we'll find out when they get back, but actively be supporting them before they go and then while they're gone. So prayer, and this outlines very helpfully. I have one of these in my office, specific things to be praying for, and then financially is always in need. If you can support any little bit helps going towards that. And then there's the hometown hero portion too, if you're interested in that kind of thing. So a lot of different ways that you can connect and support this trip. I know some folks are nervous and anxious due to the war over in Ukraine and with Russia. And so that is obviously a big deal, and we always want to be mindful of that as well. Where our team is going is closer to the action than we are here, but still far enough away, but has the opportunity to, if I recall correctly, aren't there a lot of refugees from Ukraine that are in Hungary? And so a lot of opportunity there to love on and serve them as well. So keep praying for that. Pray for the Lord to open the doors that need to be opened and for safety, but also ultimately that they can go and be a blessing and share the love of Christ and advance God's kingdom. And then lastly tonight, we have plenty of time since Nathan's not opening with song tonight. When we get to our prayer portion, we'll go over our prayer list as always. We'll divide it up, our prayer time, three focuses, three foci. We'll pray over our list first and foremost. We'll pray specifically for the Hungary trip. And then lastly, the youth tonight, Eli and Sarah and Emma have taken the youth, 8 of them, 4 boys and 4 girls, to Super Summer this week, one of their first summer camps. So they're there. If you haven't been following along online, they've been giving updates and said it's been going well, but we want to keep praying for that as well. And that's, I think, all I got. Jim and Phyllis, before I forget at the very end, these are the bracelets that Rhoda and the kiddos put together to send with y'all. There are 73 of them, and they worked really hard. So if y'all see any beads in the hallway, it was a labor of love to send this to Hungary with our team. So don't let me forget to give this to you. Okay, so tonight let's get into our lesson, and I think Nathan has showed me how to do this before, and I forgot I have this power. Let's see if it works. So theoretically, I have power to show you the slides myself. Excellent. Okay. Too much power. So just a recap. We didn't quite finish. We're going to finish tonight, and we're not going to do, for the sake of time, the full recap of all the major themes, but it's always good to rehearse those on your own. And I hope you got, if you don't have one of these, there's some on the foyer, and also like a little map too that I'm going to touch on tonight, that colored map. If you want, you can go grab one. But where we stopped last time, if you remember, the people of God had moved into the promised land. They had settled in. God, the whole way through, had been faithful. The people had not been faithful. And so they struggled with that kind of back and forth dance. But they were in and they were settled. But things were not going well because they continued to not trust and honor God and walk in His ways. And so even though they were in the land, they didn't have peace and they didn't have a lot of flourishing. And so God would allow or even raise up the neighboring countries and peoples and tribes to attack. So they fought with the Philistines, famously, and then so many others, and back and forth. And then God would send a deliverer. He would raise up a judge to whip the people into shape, to remind them of God's laws, remind them of their covenant obligations, and then lead them. And God would empower those people, those judges, with His Spirit to lead the people, to guide them, to rescue them, and to help them flourish. And things would go well, and they would honor God for a period of time. Then that judge would die off, and the people would slide back into it. And that was that cycle that we saw over and over and over. The people did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, or every man did what was right in his own eyes, and it led to evil. And so that's the repeated theme we saw. And then by the end of the book of Judges, there was this new theme that started coming up at the same time with everyone kind of doing their own thing and wondering why none of it's working out. There was no king to lead the people, and so the people were kind of in disarray. And by the end of that, and we talked last week, the people were crying out for a king. Do we remember what we said last week, why that was problematic? The people begging Samuel, the leader at the time, for a king. Why was that a problem? Is it evil or wicked to have a king? It's going to turn out bad for him. Why? Because ultimately, so there are two levels there. First and foremost, Samuel, this is what Greg's touching on, said, you don't know what you're asking for. It's not as romanticized as you think it is to have a king. It's going to take a lot from you. It's going to take your sons and your daughters. It's going to take your land and your resources. And then even if you get lucky and you get a good king, it's still going to be really difficult. But the bigger, more central core issue was you don't need a king because you already have one, and it's God. And God had been saying for generations and generations, I am your king. I am your leader. I take care of you. I provide for you. I lead you. I protect you. I save you. I am your king. And they said, yes, God, we know the history, but we want someone we can see and someone we can touch, someone who can like literally ride out in front of our armies like all the other nations. And we said that was the core issue. They wanted to not trust God and follow him. They wanted to be like everybody else. And so Samuel was angry and frustrated and disappointed with the people. And God said, no, Samuel, let's let them have it. I can work with this, as God does. And he works within the brokenness of our human frailty and sin and waywardness to still move his storyline forward, to redeem all things, and to be good to his people and his promises. So they raised up a king, and the first one was Saul. And what did we say was so impressive about Saul? He looked like a king, right? He was tall, he was handsome, he was charismatic, he was engaging. If we were to create, do y'all remember, this may be a terrible reference, do you remember, I think there was a movie in the 80s called Weird Science? Cool, don't look it up, never mind then. So if we were to create a king, we'd create one that looked like Saul, but the issue we found was, as we know today, as we teach our children today, looks can be deceiving. And it's not what's on the outside that matters, it's what's on the inside that matters. He didn't have the heart of a king. He didn't have the character of a king. And so the weight and the responsibility of being a king crushed him. And so he started well, and God had given him his spirit to lead, but Saul stopped trusting God and started taking matters into his own hands. And when that started going poorly for him, instead of returning to God and seeking God's forgiveness and help, he just kept doubling down and hardening his heart further and further. And then eventually God cut him off and said, you're done. You're out. You've done this to yourself, and I'm confirming it now. And Saul destroyed himself. And then God raised up David, right? And this is kind of where we stopped last week, so we'll talk more about David and moving forward tonight. Let's talk, what was the good thing about David? He was a man after God's own heart, which we've all heard and is very true, but what on earth does that mean? Because if you read through Scripture, this keeps coming up, that David really loved the Lord, that he was a man after God's own heart. So what does that mean? Why did he get called that? He was a servant? Yeah, what else? How else would you explain that? So he was faithful, he was a servant?
He kind of admitted to his own humanity and that he was indeed failing God, but he repented.
There it is.
And
Yeah.
yes, and he knew immediately once he, crossed the line, he knew it was wrong. It was like, oh man,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
he would repent again.
Yeah. So we believe, and scripturally, historically, God's people have believed that if we take him at his word, God is the king of the universe. It's all his. And so he can and he will and he loves to bless his people. So it makes sense for us to seek him because of what he can do for us and what he wants to do and what he's promised to do and the ways that he can bless us. And a lot of us are drawn to God in that sense, and that's fine to a degree. But what was so special about David is what he was ultimately seeking in his purest moments was, no, I want God himself, man after God's own heart. He wants to know God and belong to God. All the other stuff was good and important, but that can kind of come and go and rise and fall as David experienced, and a lot of that was his own fault. But he kept coming back to who God is and the heart of God. And so we know, too, that David wasn't just a mighty warrior as God empowered him. He wasn't just a charismatic leader and a brilliant, organizational, administrative mind. Those are all wonderful qualities that he had in varying degrees. But ultimately, at the core of it, he knew how to worship. The Psalms, so many of the Psalms came from David himself and his relationship with God. And then what you mentioned, too, of all the good and bad qualities of David, he knew when he got off track and it was revealed to him as he came to awareness or someone brought it to his awareness, he was humbled by it and he raced back to God. And he ran to God, and he repented, and he mourned, and he grieved, and he returned and chased after God's heart. And so that was the through line. But what's so important for us to see about this, again, isn't that David had that figured out. That was good, and that worked in David's favor. But ultimately, that brings him back to the God who is faithful. So yes, David was faithful in many different ways. But ultimately, what made David so enduringly special was God's faithfulness to him and through him. God made his covenant. He furthered his covenant with his people through David. Do you remember the promise specifically to David that God made? The Davidic Covenant. Do you remember any of the details? What was so special about his promises to David? From your line, I will establish your kingdom, and someone from your line will be on it forever. This everlasting, eternal kingdom, right? So this is huge. God has never given up on his promises from the very, very beginning. Despite all the ups and downs, the twists and turns of history and the ups and downs, twists and turns of his people, God continues to be faithful to his promises, and now he's furthered them and deepened them with David, saying, your kingdom that I have given you, if you trust me and follow me, it's going to go well for you. But you need to know I have set this up and it's going to last forever. No further details of what exactly that means and looks like. We today, in our spot in history, can look back and see what God was up to. But regardless, in the moment, at the time, that was a phenomenal, profound promise from God. So God is keeping things forward. David, for his flaws, because he had many, and his horrific missteps, which he had, he would come back to God, he would repent, he would grieve, he would mourn, and he would move forward in faithfulness. And God blessed him. And that leads us then to David's son, Solomon. So 1 Kings chapter 3, I want us to see something special about Solomon here. First Kings 3, 5 through 13. If someone could read that out loud for us. First Kings. I think you're like a book off. But that is also a good passage. Through verse 13. Okay, thank you. Go ahead and read verse 14 just for bonus. Okay, I wanted to throw that one in. We're not going to move fully in that direction, but we see again like kind of the two levels of God's promises here. That which is unconditional, God promises to keep his promises. And Solomon is wise to that. You've been faithful to my father. I know you are the God who is faithful to his promises. So he recognizes it. And God is. God will never abandon his promises, and there's nothing we can do about it. God's going to accomplish his purposes, big picture-wise. But then our enjoyment of the fulfillment of those things is contingent upon us as we walk in faithfulness. So there are these two levels. God is going to be true to his promises no matter what. There's nothing we can do about it. But then how we enjoy, how we participate in that is contingent upon us walking in his ways. There's a way that leads to life and a way that leads to death. So there's these kind of, they might seem like a paradox or dueling themes, but they complement each other and they overlap. What God is going to do no matter what, and then what we on our end are responsible to do and how that shakes out. But what we have here is just a stunning, beautiful example of a good king. David was a great king. Saul was terrible. He set the bar really, really low. David just smashed it and was awesome. He unified the kingdom with God. David led the kingdom to incredible heights. And not just, in terms of military victories, there was that, and then growing in wealth and influence and power, but also shaping the hearts and the worship of his people. David was a king like none other. But God had told him, your son is the one who I'm really going to truly bless. He's going to build a house of worship for me, the temple here. And so when Solomon is now on the throne, God comes to him and says, blank check. What do you want from me? You know I've been good to your father. You know I am the God of your people. What would you ask of me? And Solomon recognizes perhaps what God is doing, but if not, this was a test for where's your heart? And he responds beautifully, admirably, and he says, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't think I can do this by myself. This is such a high calling. I would like your wisdom to lead your people in a way that honors you and blesses them. That's my paraphrase. And God says, that's a great answer. That's exactly what you need. And I'm going to throw in all the rest of it beyond your wildest dreams because you have found what's most important, like your father chasing after me, right? And so that's why Solomon is that, he's a little king on the right. King David is the first prominent king, but under Solomon's reign, the monarchy, the kingdom of Israel, takes off and goes really, 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 really well. And their coffers are full, the treasury is full, they're expanding the empire, people are happy, they're at peace, they're growing in prominence, Solomon is growing in fame, but in the midst of all that, and even in the light of God's great promises, what was always a possibility that could derail the whole thing? Disobedience. Go to five chapters to the right, go to 1 Kings 9. Let's look at 1 Kings 9, 1 through 9, if someone could read that passage for us. So again, we see those two themes. God says, I will be true to my word no matter what. And if you want in on it, you can freely walk in my ways and trust me, and it'll go well for you. But if y'all do not trust, if you do not obey, if you do not walk in my ways, I'm warning you, if you turn aside, if you chase after other gods, I'll cut you off. God, in his patience with us, reminds Solomon, I was here before you, I'll be here after you. I don't need you. I want you. I love you. I'm ready to bless you, but I'm not going to force you to follow me. So we're seeing again a little bit of that kind of that tension there. But the promise is great and beautiful, and at this point, it's a no-brainer. Well, yes, duh. I mean, we're at the top, and it just gets better and better and better, and then it falls apart, right? We know Solomon's story. There's a lot of Bible characters I love. Solomon is one of my favorites because for all his wisdom, and Scripture tells us repeatedly, there's none like him. No one before him and since him has been as wise and have an expansive mind and just the power of God upon him. As wise and incredibly insightful and foresighted and all that Solomon was, he could be such an idiot at the same time. And it's like, that's a little bit of our story too. And maybe not to the same extreme, but God had warned him. God had promised him and blessed him and had positive words for him, also with negative. Like, if you keep moving in this direction with me, it's going to get better and better and better. But if you turn aside, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And so you see this struggle with Solomon. As much as God richly blessed him, which he did in ways that we can't fathom. I was reading through 1st and 2nd Kings this afternoon, and some of the little details here and there that just trying to describe some of the wealth of Solomon just was like, it was unreal. You know, we talk about like Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and all these billionaires, and I'm like, I don't understand how you have so much stuff. Solomon was just crazy wealthy in so many ways, but at the same time, he got lost in it, as God had warned him, and he got consumed by it and then warped by it. So Solomon lived on this fine line where he was incredibly wise and brilliant and could see things that no one else could see, but at the same time, he was so blind to the things that he needed to see that God kept warning him about. And so, again, kind of this back and forth, all these good things where he would use a lot of his wealth and his power and his influence to advance God's ways and God's kingdom and God's renown in the world. I mean, people are traveling from all around the world to come sit with Solomon and just listen to this guy and learn about this Yahweh and all these wonderful things. But then at the same time, Solomon was wrapped up in some horrible things. He amassed a harem. You know, he's famous for all these wives and concubines. And he used slave labor, which God had explicitly forbidden them from doing. I mean, you had been slaves in Egypt, and then Solomon turns around and uses slave labor. He started to hoard his great wealth, and then all these other things back and forth, back and forth. So look now at 1 Kings 11. I'll read out loud for us verses 1 through 8. This is kind of a heartbreaking turning passage. Now King Solomon, this is an understatement, loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, who was his wife. It was a political marriage, but Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from all the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely, mark my words, they will turn away your heart after their gods. But Solomon clung to these women in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives did exactly what God said they would, turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after their other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted or true to the Lord his God like the heart of his father had been. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Amorites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father had done. And then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, and on the mountain east of Jerusalem. And so he did all these things for his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrifice to their gods. So what was the main problem here? His heart. why is it problematic for Solomon? I mean, God had told all the people, do not marry into these peoples and these foreign tribes or whatever. And that's not xenophobia. God had important reasons for it. But why Solomon in particular was it important that he remain true and not intermix or intermarry with all these other people groups? Because he's the king. He represents God to the people and the people to God. He's not just any old person. He sets the tone. He shapes and structures the life of the people, right? And so God already had this rule, but especially it was important for Solomon to be mindful of this. And God had even warned him clearly and directly, don't go this way. It will not end well for you. This is what's going to happen. And Solomon, in his brilliance and his wisdom, did it anyway, and it ended just as horribly. And so it led him astray, and he's doling out land and property and money for his various wives and their various gods to set up temples and offer sacrifices. So it's not just that they had a place to go worship privately. Now it was available publicly. The king sets the tone. And so the people had more opportunities now to, well, if the king's doing it, and now he's set it up, and it's wonderful and it's nice, and we're drawn, and again, our eyes are off of God and what he has for us and what he's called us to, because now we're chasing after all these other things, and it's horrible. And so instead of being distinct and set apart and being a light in the darkness, Solomon led the people to participate in the darkness of the world. Kathy?
He tells us the same thing when he says, don't be unequally yoked.
Yeah.
We, as Christians, set a bad example like Solomon did in the end. We are saying to the world, oh, your sin is okay.
Yeah.
Or that particular sin is okay because I'm doing it too.
Yeah. And what happens to sin if we just kind of leave it alone? Does it go away by itself? No, right? I mean, that's the second main theme. It spirals, it grows, it's a disease, it spreads. So even if, and we don't know the full details, but we know enough about life to probably know how it played out, even if Solomon, who had built God the temple, and God said, this is the place, the passage you read, this is the place I'm going to be forever, even if Solomon wasn't initially in these temples worshiping these other gods, he allowed them to be set up, and they don't go away by themselves, and eventually it draws more and more people astray into them, and then eventually Solomon himself starts participating and moving astray, right? Sin doesn't correct itself, and God had so clearly told him. So listen as I read now verses 9 through 13. And the Lord, understatement here, was angry with Solomon, because his heart had been turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this very thing, that he should not go after other gods. But Solomon did not keep what the Lord commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, it's not a oops, I accidentally, it has now become a practice, a rhythm of his life. And because you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you, and I'll give it to your servant. Verse 12, yet for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear it away all of the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen. Again, we see the dueling, the tension here. God is going to be true to his promises. He'll never abandon them. But when the people do not listen and trust and follow him, he's like, I have no problem cutting you off from this, just as I warned you on the front end. I have no problem. And so he's maintaining his promise to David, and at the same time maintaining his promise to Solomon that if you step aside, if you turn astray and do not come back to me, I will discipline you. And if you do it enough, you've hardened your heart enough, I will cut you off. And so he does. But because of your father, I won't do it in your lifetime, but just know it's coming because you had the responsibility to lead the people. And he did not lead them well. So what we learn from this passage is God was not playing around. Still, God is not playing around with sin and with holiness and with righteousness and faithfulness to his covenant. So God is always true on his end, and he expects and requires of us to be true on our end. And Solomon learned that firsthand. And so then from there, God didn't just raise up some adversaries to pester Israel, but starting with Solomon's son, this gets into our next theme, he divided the land. The kingdom was split, and it fell horribly apart. There we go. Okay. So now we're into the two kingdoms, the divided kingdom. And these two kingdoms, if you know the history, have different names. The northern 10 tribes of Israel and the southern 2 tribes of Judah. They have different kings, different trajectories, different capitals, and they don't often get along with each other. Let me show you the next slide because I think this is my map. You can kind of see that. If not, there was a handout, hopefully, that you grabbed on the way in. So we see here the two kingdoms set up. So Solomon eventually dies, and all the things that God said was going to come to pass came to pass. And Solomon's son tried to lead, and it wasn't good. He was not good. And so the rest of the nation rebelled against him, and that started this, horrific history of just issues with each other, with surrounding countries, with themselves, back and forth. And the biblical story after Solomon, it zooms out and covers a whole lot of ground really quickly. The rest of 1st and 2nd Kings covers just really the soap opera that plays out of the succession of the kings of Israel and of Judah. And sometimes it goes well for a little bit. Judah in particular had 2 really good kings, Hezekiah and Josiah, who brought the people back to the ways of the Lord. But for the most part, it was just, these guys are terrible. And they're leading the people to do terrible things. And then the next one, gosh, he's terrible too. He's just as bad, if not worse. And so if you remember the theme that we talked about in Judges, where everyone did what was right in their own eyes and they did evil in the sight of the Lord, a very similar parallel theme shows up in 1st and 2nd Kings. This repeated phrase keeps coming up. And he, the king, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that his fathers had done. So we see this horrible cycle being continued and being passed down, and they're just destroying themselves and having all sorts of problem. And that leads us to 2 other different people, or not topics, subjects, themes in the Old Testament that we want to track with that goes along with this. Let me go back to there we go. Do you see the little guys? I don't have my laser pointer. Do you see the little guys at the bottom? Looks like they're screaming. Can you tell that? Those are the prophets. So we got the 2 kingdoms. It's been split after David and Solomon. We got kings at the top and got kings at the south, right? The northern kingdom eventually, and we'll get to this here in a second, gets conquered and sent into exile. Eventually the southern kingdom does as well. But all along the way, this testifies to not the anger of God, even though that's on full display, but the goodness of God, saying, I will not let you destroy yourselves ignorantly. I will continually give you options. I will continually give you opportunities to wake up, to listen, to return to me and the covenant that is so good for you. Prophet after prophet after prophet, and the people didn't care. So let's talk about prophets real quick. What comes to mind, or if you remember last summer when we went through the 12 minor prophets, what comes to mind when you hear that term? What is a prophet? A proclaimer of God's truth. That is a very good textbook answer. Thank you. How else do you articulate or explain what a prophet is? A spokesman for God. So y'all just saved me a lot of time talking. So that's the core of where I was about to go next. We often think it's someone who has these mystical trances and sees the future and then tells everyone. There are elements of foretelling. But most of what they do is forthtelling, is they are listening to God. God is speaking through them and telling the people what they need to know right here, right now. God's truth, how it plays out right here, right now. You need to know it. And most of the time it's wake up. Stop doing what you're doing. It's not going to end well. And God, through some of the prophets, would say, I'm going to tell you how it's going to end if you don't wake up and come back. So there was some foretelling. This is what's down the line if you don't wise up. But most of it was hey, do you know what you're doing? Or, hey, stop what you're doing. Here, let me tell you what you're doing so that you can stop and you can return to God. And it was messy. I remember when I was younger, I used to think it would be so cool to be a prophet. And then I grew up and I took Scripture more seriously and was reading it more seriously. And I was like, oh, it'd be horrible to be a prophet. Because, you liked prophets sometimes, When they anoint the new king that you like, yay, we love this prophet. But most of the time, they had a really rough job because they're telling people things that are true that they don't want to hear. You're sinning. Stop. God is not happy with this. And speaking truth to power is a modern phrase, but they, with the power of God, the Spirit of God upon them, would go call out, anyone and everyone. And that was the core thing. And that's what's so interesting. As the prophets were listening to God, as we see as you track through the prophets, he's calling all sorts of different men from different places to be used in different times and in different ways to advance God's truth and his purposes. And the issue wasn't just the kings. That was hugely influential because the king is so powerful and influential, but it was all the people. All the people. The prophets are saying, listen to God. Return to God. The way that you're living does not honor him, does not bless you, isn't a testimony to the rest of the world. Instead, it's problematic and it's destructive and it's going to end poorly. And in some cases, the people would listen. Or in some cases, the king would listen. But most of the time, big picture, they wouldn't. And so the prophets would scream louder, or God would send a different prophet and say, stop trusting in appearances. Again, there's that repeated theme. Just because you're wealthy, just because you're powerful, just because everything seems to be going well, does not mean it's going to end well. And the people said, what do you know? You don't know anything. Let us figure this out. And so they found out the hard way that if they refused to own up to their sin, repent of their sin, turn back to God, that he would punish them. And that leads to the next main group that we want to talk about, and that's these foreign empires. Look at 2 Kings 17. We're going to look at two different passages in 2 Kings. 2 Kings 17, and I'm going to read verses 5 through 8, and then we'll jump over to chapter 24. So 2 Kings 17, verses 5 through 8. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria. So this is the northern kingdom of Israel. Their capital was Samaria. And for 3 years he besieged it. And in the 9th year of King Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria, and he placed them in Halah and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. Verse 7 is key here. And this occurred, why? Because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods, and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord had driven out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. And the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. Flip over to chapter 24. Listen as I read verses 1 through 4. In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, rose up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. So this is, we're going to be talking about the southern kingdom of Judah. And then he turned, Jehoiakim, the kind of puppet king of Judah, rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar and the empire of Babylon. And the Lord sent against him bands of the Chaldeans, and bands of the Syrians, and bands of the Moabites, and bands of the Ammonites, and sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by his servants the prophets. Surely this came upon Judah at the command of the Lord, to remove them out of his sight for the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he had done, and also for the innocent blood that he had shed. For he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord would not pardon it. So, why did the kingdom that David and Solomon, with God's power and blessing, had taken to such great heights, why did it split? The unfaithfulness of the king and the people. Then these two kingdoms, as they're tracking through history, why did they get worse and worse? Because of the unfaithfulness of the king and the people. And then ultimately, why did these two kingdoms, with God's great promises and God's great laws and their heritage and their history and the legacy and everything, why did they eventually get crushed and conquered and sent into exile? because they had been unfaithful and refused to trust God and walk in his ways. And so God says, I have been telling you for generation after generation after generation, giving you chance after chance after chance, sending you judges and leaders and prophets to tell you. And now it's too late. Now it's too late. And so these world empires, first the Assyrians, then eventually the Assyrians get judged too, and then it's the Babylonians. They come swooping in, and they crush and they conquer God's people, just like they crushed and conquered everything in their way. And what's important for us to see is what we could call a theology of history. If you're looking at it just flatly, just like studying history, we see that makes sense. There have been empires that rise and fall. Egypt was one. The Assyrians were one, the Babylonians were one, the Roman. So that's just human history, right? Someone rises to world power, they conquer, and then eventually they fade, and then another one comes. We can look at it that way, and that's some of it, but the Bible says there's actually a deeper storyline here. There's a deeper current, and it's God. God had told his people this was coming. God was saying, I will use the other nations around you that you're so desperate to be like, I will let them be your undoing. And if you keep testing me, and then in my love, I will discipline you by letting them crush and conquer you, to take away all the things that you think are so important, but I will still be true to my promises. So from the biblical perspective, this is God's fault. It's the people's fault. But this is God driving this, using whomever he wants to discipline his own people. And that does not mean the Assyrians and the Babylonians kind of get off scot-free. If you remember when we read through the prophets last year, they get judged too. They're going to stand accountable before God too. But God is trying to teach his people to stop being so stubborn and hard-hearted. So in 720 BC, the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. And then in 586 BC, the Babylonians conquered the southern kingdom of Judah. And if you remember, how did the people feel at this point, in either of these points? What was the problem? I mean, no one likes to lose in battle, so we get that. But what was the deeper issue? Why were the people so devastated?
Because they didn't think that God would allow the temple to be destroyed.
Yeah.
And that they were God's chosen people, and that he wouldn't allow their kingdom to be destroyed.
Yeah. So what was their issue? Because all that's true. I mean, that was.
Didn't think there was any consequences for what they were doing.
Yeah. They presumed. Instead of trusting the promises of God, they presumed upon the promises of God. No, we got the promises in the bank. We're good. We can do whatever we want. The northern kingdom was crushed and just absolutely destroyed and wiped out, and people scattered all over the place and sent into slavery, into exile, and anyone that's left is just working the fields. Surely, the southern kingdom, surely that wouldn't happen to us. That's their problem. And then the same thing happened to them, right? Well, God wouldn't let that happen to us. No, he did, because God is reminding them too, I don't need any of these. All these things are secondary. What's primary is you trusting me, you worshiping me, you following me, and then watching what I can do and will do for you and through you. So they had been riding high for so long that they had been blinded by it. And they thought they were untouchable. So when the unthinkable happened, despite God's warnings, when the unthinkable happened, it wasn't just that they were reeling. I mean, they had the Book of Lamentations is beautiful and profound. They don't even know who they are anymore. So it's not just, we know warfare is horrific and awful. It's not just like we lost the war, our people have been killed, our leaders have been sent out. That's bad enough as it is, but the deeper issue is we don't even know who we are anymore. Like, we existed because of God's promises to give us a land and a kingdom and all this blessing, and now all of that's gone. Like, the temple is gone. That's where God was. That's where his presence, where he promised was going to be with us forever. And now we have none of it. And they have no idea what to do. They have no idea who they are anymore. And so they are drunk with grief and confusion and desperation, and they mourn and they grieve and they cry out to God because they're like, what on earth could possibly be next? And we'll talk about that next week. But let me close with this. The people, as we see and we need to see, because this is our story, the people had brought this upon themselves because of their repeated willful rebellion. Again, one of the things we said was great about David, when he messed up, and he did, and it wasn't just messed up, when he did some really egregious things and became aware of it or was made aware of it, he owned up to it. He admitted it, he confessed, and he did whatever he could to come racing back to God in repentance. It was beautiful. The kings after him did not follow that, and the people did not follow that either. They kept doubling down, and they kept doubling down, and they kept doubling down, and it got worse and worse and worse. And a few of them would get by if they were crafty enough or worldly enough, adopting the patterns and the ways of the world. They could get by, just as we can today. But ultimately, it wasn't just unfruitful, it was their undoing. The things that they kept clamoring for and chasing after to give them meaning and fulfillment were the very same things that crushed them and distorted and warped their souls. So God had told them, this is coming if you don't stop. As they're on their way down, turn around, until they hit rock bottom. So we also see in the midst of this that God is not interested in or distracted by the things that we're interested in and distracted by. God loves to give good things to his people. He loves to give gifts. But the gifts are never the point. It's always him and his relationship with his people, but his people often do not see it. But nonetheless, God still never abandons his people. Even though they deserve it, he always preserves what we call a righteous remnant. And he keeps saying, because of the promises I've made to Abraham, because of the promises I've made to David, your father, your forefather, I will not let you be completely wiped out. You're going to have no idea, this generation and the next, and maybe even the next, will have no idea what I'm up to, but I won't let you be completely snuffed out. I'm always at work. I'm always doing something because I can do all things if you would just trust me. So as they move then into this season of history, of exile, God will be still pursuing his people, shaping his people, calling his people to trust him and follow him and have their eyes open to what it is that he's up to. And we'll get to that next week. Okay, that was a lot. I tried to be short and it went long. Any thoughts or questions on any of this tonight? Yeah, please. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He said, you know the path. Inevitably, when you get off, I'm telling you up front, it's coming, but when you do, I'm already telling you how to come back. I'm showing you the way back. When you get there, you're going to get there, but when you get there, that doesn't have to be the end. I'm showing you the path back. And yet the people got there and just like, I don't know what to do. We should probably just keep going this way, right? And it never ends well that way. That's a really good point. Any other comments on any of that?
I was reminded of the verse in Matthew 6:33. But seek first his kingdom
Yeah.
and his righteousness,
Mm-hmm.
and all these things will be added unto you.
Yeah. Seek first the kingdom. All these other things are good. God knows. He will provide. But there's one thing that's of primary importance, right? Seek these things first. That's good. Okay. Any other comments? Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah, so I want to follow that thought. That's a really, really good point. So on our own, we can and we do make a mess of things. And left on our own, that's a period at the end of that sentence. I have done this, or I have followed these things, I've worshiped other gods, however that plays out, right? That's the end of the story for us on our own, left on our own, period. But God, in his infinite goodness and his mercy and his grace and his wisdom, refuses to let that be a period, and he makes it a comma or a semicolon, right? And so even when we do these things, even when it's blatant and it's willful and it's repeated and it's the worst of the worst, if we will stop and recognize that God is still good and he's still calling us, that doesn't just make that just vanish. There are still consequences. Even when David repented, he still faced very serious consequences. His family, ooh man, talk about, again, soap opera. He dealt with the fallout of his sin, but God didn't let his sin be the end of him. God says, okay, come back to me and then watch what I can do and how I can redeem this. Not minimize, not act like it didn't happen. To forgive you, yes, but then work in and through the brokenness that you have caused, but to bring about good for his glory and for the good of people, right? So absolutely, on our own, we get off, and then if we stay on our own, we're just stuck there. But even if we get off and we get to the bottom and the worst of the worst, if we will turn, the prodigal son, if we'll come to our senses and turn to our Father, he says, watch what I can do and how I can redeem all things. Absolutely, great point. Anything else tonight? Okay, thank you. Let's go over our prayer lists.